Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Lords of the Fallen 2023. I played on the Xbox Series X. It's also available on the PS5 and PC. So in Lords of the Fallen, you pick your class, I guess, make your character, and you go out into the world. Well, actually you don't. You're resurrected by a magic lamp. Upon being resurrected, you're basically given the objective to get to one point where you're given the quest to go and light the beacons to stop the rise of an evil god. And that basically sums up the story. There are some other small side stories around characters, this being a soulsbourne. There's some lore going on, lore behind a variety of things. I would say the lore is far deeper than the story. But it's not a really strong story, and I don't think it's a driving force in this game. But let's get on to the audio, and I'm gonna say the music is totally good, it's totally adequate, it's nothing that I'm going to seek out afterwards, but works very well at the time. As for the voiceover work, I think it's good. I don't think it's amazing or award-winning by any stretch of the imagination, but it also doesn't need to be for this type of game. As for the sound effects, I think the sound effects are good. I actually appreciate the sound effects in this game. I think they do a good job with the world, especially the Umbral world, which I'll get into more in gameplay, I guess. But just the world around you in general, ambient noises, creature noises, combat noises, I think it's all very well done, and I had no disappointment with it. Let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot. And as I've already mentioned, this is a Soulsbourne game. And I kind of remember the first game being very much one of the early Soulsbourne knockoffs, before everybody else was trying to make the tough but fair Soulsbourne RPG. And I will say, I think that game was actually considerably easier than this one. Not to say that this is necessarily the hardest Soulsbourne that I have played, but it's also not the easiest. And it's definitely harder than the first Lords of the Fallen. When I can get through a boss fight without taking any damage, you know it's not the hardest Soulsbourne. And that definitely didn't happen in the 2023 Lords of the Fallen. But it being a Soulsbourne makes it an action RPG, and you go through areas, you fight enemies, you find bosses, and you try and beat the bosses, rinse and repeat. And for me, it was a lot of repeating beating the bosses, because they were more challenging than I was anticipating. Because honestly, while there are times and there are enemies in areas where it's far harder, I was not expecting the bosses to be as hard as they were based on how easy it was to kill a lot of the scrub monsters. Or not even scrub monsters, just the monsters on your way to areas. But as I sort of mentioned earlier, there are also like some side quests you can go on, and like any good Soulsbourne, there's not a whole lot of guiding for those. I'm also going to say that I think some of the maps kind of suck, because I definitely got lost on one to the point where I finally just broke out a guide, and by broke out I mean looked up a guide and started watching a YouTube video on where the fuck to go. Maybe that was just me, but I have found other Soulsbourne games easier to navigate, even some of the big ones, you know? Then I'm gonna get into the lamp and the whole Umbral area and all of that jazz. First off, you have a magic lamp and you can manipulate enemies with it. You can also run into like Umbral parasites that you have to destroy, and that's a pain in the ass. Especially with certain enemies. That mechanic I don't think flowed as well as it could, because dealing with the Umbral parasites is a bitch, or can be. But there is basically your normal world and then the Umbral world, which is kind of this weird spirit realm. And the lamp actually allows you to view the Umbral world and interact with certain things. Like, you can't open objects and whatnot in the Umbral world, but you can be attacked by Umbral enemies, as well as there's areas on the map that you can only walk on if they're in the Umbral world, but you don't have to necessarily go into the Umbral world to access those. But you can actually fully jump into the Umbral world one of two ways. You can either use the lamp and just pull yourself straight into it, or you can die, at which point you'll be resurrected in the Umbral world. And there are times where you need to be fully in the Umbral world to progress and open doors, etc. There are also some advantages to being in the Umbral world, like if you want to farm XP and grind out some levels, you get more XP being in the Umbral world, but you are putting yourself in danger. It's a risk-reward situation, because there are enemies that will basically just pop up out of the ground after a certain amount of time and try and kill you, and they can if you are not careful. Also, being in the Umbral world, there are just other enemies around, so there are more enemies to get experience from, plus the XP bonus. But from a gameplay standpoint, suffice to say, if you have played a Soulsbourne, you know more or less what you are getting yourself into. And while I think overall the gameplay is pretty good, I don't think it's the best I've experienced. I will say it does succeed for the most part at being tough but fair. But like most of these games, some of the platforming elements are As well as some of the umbral elements. While it's a neat concept, I think some more work could have been put into balancing some of that shit out. But at the same time, it is kind of nice to, when you die, pop up in the umbral world and have just that little bit of extra chance to maybe beat a boss or an enemy. I think one of my biggest issues from a gameplay standpoint, and it will also bleed into controls here in a second, would be the lock-on system. When I was just doing puzzles and trying to unlock doors and you had to lock on certain things and use the lamp for that, worked fine. But in combat, there were times where I was trying to lock on to an enemy and it would just be like, nah, fuck you, you didn't do that. And it would definitely put me in danger. Or I would kill an enemy, turn to face another enemy, and I'd try and lock on and it wouldn't lock on. It would lock on to some other enemy. The lock-on system just doesn't work the way it needs to, especially in combat situations when you're really relying on it. So that's kind of a downside, which will bleed into the controls. And like I said, there are times where you'd push the stick to lock on and it would just not do it. That, for obvious reasons, is incredibly frustrating, and it's a problem both like mechanically and a controller problem. So I don't even know what to say about it. Fuck that though, I guess. As for the melee and the dodging, I found all of that to work well. I found the movement was actually pretty nice and smooth, and your character moves at a decent clip, which is enjoyable because some of these games you really plod along. There were some other inconsistencies, I guess, in the controls. There were times where I would definitely hit the attack button 3 times and I would attack 3 times, but then there were times where I'd hit 3 times and I would only attack twice. So the occasional weird inconsistency there, and yes, that was a problem that got me killed a couple of times. So overall, I could be happier with the controls in this game. I don't think they're necessarily the worst thing I've experienced, but they could definitely have been better than what they were. Let's get into the graphics and visuals, and the first thing I'm going to say is it's not an ugly game, but it's also not the best looking game for a next-gen game. But I do think the graphics are good enough to bring the designs to life. I won't sit here and say that I was necessarily really blown away by all of the enemy designs. I do think they were good and unique enough. But what impressed me more was the world. I actually really enjoyed the world. I think it's not exactly things we haven't seen before, but I think they put their own twist on it enough. And I think that kind of sums up the visuals of this game. Everything looks good and they have their own design, but it's not so far removed from things we've experienced previously. I will say I think they have some pretty cool character designs. I liked my character's armor and sword. Looking at the other characters that I could have created, I liked their setups too. I think the lighting in the world was pretty neat, and the umbral design, I really actually liked the umbral world. I thought it had a good, creepy, nether world, somewhere between death and life kind of vibe going on. I think they landed that well. And then tying the umbral world into how it interacts with the rest of the world, I thought was a cool concept. I think the animation was also good for the combat and for the creatures. They feel, creature-like. I just think the animation did a good job bringing it all to life. But I am going to have to jump in and just really shit on one part. There was a stretch of time, and I don't know why this happened, because it just kind of came out of nowhere. I'd been playing for hours and hours with no problem, and I played for hours and hours afterwards with, again, no problem. But there was a stretch of time where my frame rate was super inconsistent, and it really showed the most during a boss fight, and through several attempts, to the point where it absolutely fucked me in that boss fight, which is just never acceptable. And in case you're curious, yes, I started out in visual fidelity mode, and then I switched to performance mode, and I still had the same problem. I had to fully quit out of the game and then get back in for it to stop being that way. But let's get into the wrap up, and the long and short of it is, I already played a better Soulsbourne this month. Or at least one that I enjoyed more. Not to sit there and say that Lords of the Fallen is terrible and I regret playing it, because I don't. I actually like the design, I like the world, but there are better ones out there, and after some patching this could turn into a better one, but currently it's not the best one that's out there, it's not the worst one out there. So it's going to be one of those ones where I will sort of recommend it, but with the addendum of if you have another one that you're playing and you're more into, I would play that, wait for this to maybe get patched, maybe drop in price a bit, actually definitely drop in price a bit. Okay, in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, did you play the first Lords of the Fallen? Which, this is also not a sequel, I don't think. I don't know if it's a reboot, I don't know what it is. And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, and if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one. But it's also not in need. Fuck, I can't words today.